Now, so let's take a look at the story. And let's take a look at the leading figures. So we know, for example, that the figure of Satan in Christianity is associated with a number of strange forms, right? The first association we know of is that he's associated with the dragon in the Garden of Eden, right? So there's a profound ambivalence in Christianity about the meaning of the opening act of Genesis. Because on the one hand, you have, when Adam and Eve are still profoundly unconscious, they don't suffer. But they're profoundly unconscious, right? They're not self-conscious. They're not aware of themselves. So in many ways, they're still animals. So there's a Gnostic line of speculation. The Gnostics were a Christian sect that believed that redemption could at least partly be attained by understanding rather than just faith. The Gnostics believed that the serpent that tempted Adam and Eve towards self-consciousness was a more developed aspect of God than the God that had created Adam and Eve to begin with, because the unconsciousness that characterized Adam and Eve was too underdeveloped to be perfect. And so they had to be tempted forward into a more fully developed consciousness. And so although classical Christianity associated the serpent in the tree with Lucifer, who's the bringer of light, who's Satan, the Gnostic thread of reasoning said, well, wait a minute, it's not that simple, because yeah, self-consciousness makes you aware of death and vulnerability and knocks you out into the profane world, but there's an aspect of it that kind of looks like enlightenment. And you know this already in your own lives, because often when you believe something and you're unconsciously convinced of the adequacy of that model, and then you find that it's not sufficient, right? And so you crumble in disappointment. You put your trust in someone and you find out, say, they're not worthy of that trust, and that the evidence that enlightens you breaks that frame of reference and makes you collapse. You think, that's a terrible thing. You can't help but feel that as a real betrayal and as an act even of evil. But then a year later, 2 years later, you might look back and think, God, you know, I really needed that. I really needed that lesson, because as a consequence of learning that, I'm much more mature and much more likely to establish stable relationships. And so it's easy to see that from one perspective something can be terrible, and then from another it might not be terrible at all. And even in classic Christianity you get this strange ambivalence about the events in Genesis that runs something like this. Well, yes, it was an act of the most evil spirit, the spirit of enlightenment, the spirit of rationality, or the bringer of light, Lucifer, to knock Adam and Eve out of their transcendental unconsciousness and to start history. It was an evil act. But on the other hand, it was also the precondition for the later emergence of Christ, and as far as the Christians are concerned, that's the greatest event in history. So without this initial opening act, right, this tragic opening act, there'd be no reason for the whole redemptive story, and therefore, considered from the perspective of the total story, the opening tragedy cannot purely be considered evil. Very, very complicated line of reasoning. Now, the other thing you see here, and I think this relates back to our initial map, is, and this also helps you understand the way people think. Now, I said already that it's real easy to confuse tragedy and evil, right? Okay, so what that means is that it's real easy to confuse the negative aspect of the unknown with evil. And likewise, it's very easy to confuse the negative aspect of culture with evil. Your own culture, the tyrannical aspect of it, or the culture of other people. So it's very easy, for example, for us to demonize the foreigner. And that's basically because there's a part of our mind that presumes that all things that strike us negatively, all things that produce negative emotion on our part, like fear, are the same thing. So there's a blurry category of evil that's all terrible natural things, all terrible social things, and then whatever nastiness the individual can generate among themselves. It's much more useful to draw a clear distinction between these different categories, because that clarity of thought can help you focus in most specifically on those things that the individual is responsible for in terms of turning the world to waste. So Milton says this figure of Satan, Lucifer, the light bringer, always associated with rationality. Milton presents him as a remarkable creature, right? He's the highest angel in God's heavenly hierarchy. He's Christ's elder brother in a similar mythological vein. He's the most powerful angel that ever lived. So, at least in the opening stages of this act, Satan is presented as something absolutely remarkable. Now, the problem is here, his very remarkableness starts to work against him. And what happens is that as he grows in power and strength in this heavenly hierarchy, he starts to become convinced that the omniscient himself, whatever that transcendent figure is unnecessary. So the idea is that whatever Satan represents decides, because of his own pride, his own belief in his own sufficiency, that the transcendent can be eradicated from consideration. And the way Milton presents that is as a revolution in heaven, fundamentally. So imagine that the story is something like this. Well, George Kelly, way back in like 1955, noted that what human beings like more than anything else, really, when you get right down to it, is to be right. Why? Well, it's a pain to be wrong, right? Because if you're wrong, then the little structure that you're using to conjure up the world has to dissolve, and then you have to do a lot of really aggravating work, exploratory work and creative work, to put it back together. And during the time before you put it back together, then you're flooded with negative motivational states, right? You don't know which way is up, metaphorically speaking. So we don't like not to be right. And so what does that mean? Well, psychologists know that people have a very strong confirmatory bias, which basically means that if you bring a frame of reference to bear on the world, the probability is very high that you will look for confirming evidence, and you will discount disconfirming evidence. Now, the other thing that is characteristic of great figures of evil like Satan is their tendency to lie, right? So Satan is prince of the lie. Now, what does that mean exactly? So T.S. Eliot wrote this poem called The Cocktail Hour. He talks about this woman who goes in for psychiatric treatment, and the woman says to the psychiatrist, "I'm telling you, I really, really hope there's something wrong with me, because I'm having a miserable time of it. And as far as I can tell, there's only two options here. Either I'm okay, and I'm having a miserable time because the world is terrible, in which case there's nothing I can do about it, or there's something wrong with me at some level of analysis that I don't really comprehend, and although that's a painful option, I'm really hoping it's true, because if there's something wrong with me, possibly I can fix it, and if there's something wrong with the structure of the world, well, what's there to do about that?" Often what you see in psychotherapy is a battle between those two perspectives going on in the minds of the client. The client is in a situation where they're repetitively facing tragedy. They have a specific viewpoint about the world, like their viewpoint might be, well, when it comes right down to it, you really can't trust other people. And they have all sorts of reasons for believing that. Maybe they were abused as children, or they've had a bad developmental history, a number of relationships that haven't gone well. They have all the facts at their disposal to justify that particular perspective, but the truth of the matter is that as long as they hold on to that belief and won't let it go, and no wonder they won't, they're going to continue to suffer. And part of what you're always doing to someone in therapy is saying, you know, yeah, you got a pretty coherent view of the world and all that, and I can understand why you'd like to cram the whole world into that coherent perspective, but the truth of the matter is, as long as you hold on to that and won't sacrifice it, right, won't go through this terrible period of dissolution, it's always going to produce the same tragic consequences. So as long as you hold on to your belief rigidly, everything around you is going to go from bad to worse.